This little piece of clay is packed full of information from 4,200 years ago.
In a basement at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, an old man sits hunched over a small tablet of dried clay. His hands are unsteady now. His eyesight isn't what it used to be, but he can still read the wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface almost 4,000 years ago, because he is one of the only people alive who can. His name is Samuel Noah Kramer, and by the time of his death in 1990, at the age of 93, he had spent more than 60 years doing something that sounds almost impossible, teaching himself, and then the world, how to read a language that had been dead for 2,000 years before Rome was founded. This is his real story, not a conspiracy, not a deathbed confession the academic world tried to bury. Just the actual extraordinary life of the man most responsible for the fact that we know anything at all about the world's first civilization. Kramer was born in 1897 in Zashkiv, a small town near Kiev in what was then the Russian Empire. His family was Jewish, and like millions of others, they emigrated to the United States in the first decade of the 20th century, settling in Philadelphia. He grew up poor, the son of immigrants, in a city that would end up defining the rest of his life without him knowing it yet. Kramer's path to Sumer was anything but direct. After high school, he drifted. He taught for a while in his father's small Hebrew school, tried his hand at writing, even flirted with a career in business. He was pushing 30 with no settled career when he made a decision that would eventually reshape an entire field of scholarship. He went back to the one thing he actually knew well, the Hebrew education of his youth, and enrolled at Dropsy College in Philadelphia to study Semitic languages. It was there, almost by accident, that everything changed. Kramer had planned to specialize in Egyptology, but a falling out with the Egyptology professor at Dropsy pushed him toward a different, far more obscure discipline: Assyriology, the study of the ancient cuneiform writing cultures of Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians. He transferred to the University of Pennsylvania to study under Ephraim Spicer, a rising star in Near Eastern studies, and in 1929 he earned his Ph.D. He was already in his early 30s. Most academics that age are years into their careers. Kramer hadn't even started. Here is the detail that makes Kramer's career almost unbelievable in hindsight. When he began working seriously on Sumerian in the 1930s, the field barely existed. Sumerian isn't related to any language spoken today, not Arabic, not Hebrew, not any of the Indo-European languages. It's what linguists call a language isolate, with no known living relatives. It had been extinct as a spoken tongue for roughly 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, surviving only as a scholarly and liturgical language among later Babylonian scribes, the way Latin survived in medieval Europe long after Rome fell. Nobody in the modern world had grown up speaking it. There was no native speaker to consult, no complete dictionary, no settled grammar. Everything scholars knew had been painstakingly reconstructed, tablet by tablet, over the preceding decades by a small handful of pioneers. When Kramer entered the field, that reconstruction was still in its early, uncertain stages, full of gaps and disputed readings. Kramer spent the 1930s cutting his teeth on this material. First at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, where he specialized in Sumerian grammar and syntax, and then in the field itself. He took part in excavations in Iraq in the early 1930s at sites including Tel Bila, Tipgora, and Farah, getting his hands on the physical, dusty reality of the civilization he was trying to reconstruct on paper. One of the strange and frustrating realities of Sumerian literature is that a single ancient composition is almost never found intact on a single tablet. Ancient scribes copied out portions of longer works onto individual clay tablets as school exercises or archival copies, and over the centuries those tablets scattered. Some crumbled to dust, some were looted, some ended up, quite legally by the standards of the day, in museum collections in Philadelphia, Istanbul, London, Paris, and beyond. A single myth might exist as fragments spread across 4 or 5 different museums on 3 different continents, each holding a piece nobody else had ever connected to the others. Kramer became renowned, above almost anything else, for physically piecing these fragments back together, sometimes literally, joining broken tablet fragments held in different collections, more often intellectually, recognizing that a fragment in Philadelphia and a fragment in Istanbul were copies of the same lost poem. In the late 1930s, he traveled to Istanbul to copy Sumerian literary tablets held in the Museum of the Ancient Orient there, publishing that material in the 1940s. He returned to the Istanbul collection again in the late 1940s and early 1950s. This kind of work, unglamorous, painstaking, requiring near total command of a fragmentary and half-reconstructed language, was Kramer's genius. He didn't just read Sumerian. He rebuilt the library it belonged to, one shard at a time. From 1942 onward, Kramer's career was anchored at the University of Pennsylvania, first as a research associate in the University Museum's Babylonian collection, then as associate curator, and from 1948 to his retirement in 1968 as Clark Research Professor of Assyriology and curator of the Tablet Collection, a position that made him, in practice, the central clearinghouse for Sumerian scholarship in the United States. Kramer's scholarly publications piled up for 2 decades before he did something unusual for an academic of his era. He wrote a book for ordinary readers. In 1956, he published what would become his most famous work, originally titled From the Tablets of Sumer and later reissued as History Begins at Sumer. Its premise was simple and its impact was enormous. It laid out in accessible prose a long list of things the Sumerians appear to have done first in recorded human history: the first known system of writing, the first law codes, the first known love poem, the first known lullaby, the first known library catalog, the first known proverbs, among many others. The book didn't just popularize Sumerian studies. It essentially created a popular audience for them where none had existed before. Generations of readers who had never heard the word Sumer outside a museum placard encountered, through Kramer, the idea that the roots of law, literature, education, and government stretched back not to Greece or Rome, but to a scatter of mud brick cities in southern Iraq 5,000 years ago. Over his career, Kramer wrote or contributed to roughly 30 books, ranging from highly technical grammatical studies to popular works like the Sumerians, Their History, Culture, and Character, 1963, and late in life, a collaboration with the storyteller Diane Wolkstein on Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, 1983, which brought Sumerian myth to yet another audience through retellings of hymns and stories about the goddess Inanna. By the later decades of his career, Kramer had become, without much competition, the most publicly recognized Sumerologist in the world. He was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 1949 and later received its John Frederick Lewis Prize. In 1971, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and named an International Fellow of the British Academy. He held Guggenheim Fellowships across his career, received multiple honorary degrees, and in 1987, 3 years before his death, the American Philosophical Society awarded him its Benjamin Franklin Medal for his role in recovering knowledge of early human history that might otherwise have been permanently lost. When the University of Pennsylvania Museum marked his 90th birthday, it did so with a public symposium bringing together much of the world's Sumerological community, a fitting tribute to a scholar who had trained, influenced, or corresponded with nearly everyone working in the field. Even after his official retirement in 1968, Kramer kept working, taking positions at Indiana University and later at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, and continuing to publish into his final years. He also, unusually for a man of his generation and profession, wrote his own memoir. In 1988, 2 years before his death, Kramer published In the World of Sumer, an autobiography, a candid look back at the winding, uncertain path that had brought a directionless young man in his late 20s to becoming the world's foremost authority on a 5,000-year-old civilization. In it he described himself, with characteristic self-deprecation, as a scholar who knew a great deal about a very narrow subject, an astonishingly deep field that few others had ever entered. It's worth being clear about something, because it's easy for the genuinely strange and fascinating parts of Sumerian civilization to get exaggerated into something they're not. Kramer never claimed, in any interview, article, or book that survives in the historical record, that Sumerian civilization possessed a lost mode of consciousness, hidden technology, or forbidden knowledge that the academic establishment suppressed. What he did spend his career pointing out, consistently, publicly, in peer-reviewed venues, not in secret footnotes, is something quieter but genuinely important. Translation is interpretation, and interpreting a 5,000-year-old worldview through modern categories is difficult and imperfect work. Sumerian religious and cosmological texts really do resist easy translation into modern terms. The Sumerians really did use a base, 60, sexagesimal counting system, parts of which survive today in how we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees, a mathematical choice scholars generally attribute to its usefulness for fractions and trade calculations, since 60 divides evenly by so many numbers. Sumerian astronomers and priests really did track celestial cycles with impressive precision for their era. Sumerian civilization really did undergo a long, gradual political decline and eventual absorption into later Akkadian and Babylonian culture around the start of the 2nd millennium BCE. And the later textual record really does look different in character from the earlier one, shaped by different political circumstances, different scribal schools, and centuries of cultural change. The kind of transformation any civilization undergoes over 1,000 years. None of this amounts to a hidden, suppressed truth. It's the ordinary, fascinating difficulty of ancient history. A civilization thought in categories that don't map neatly onto ours, and reconstructing that thought from broken clay fragments, one word at a time, was and remains genuinely hard work, the kind of work that occupied Kramer's entire adult life. Kramer died of throat cancer on November 26, 1990, in Philadelphia, at the age of 93. He was survived by his wife, Millie Tokarski Kramer, a Chicago mathematics teacher he had married decades earlier. His obituary in the New York Times called him a leading authority on Sumer, a description that undersold, if anything, just how singular his role had been. There was no suppressed confession, no forbidden interview, no colleague who went pale and told him his life's work was invalid. What there was, instead, was a man who spent 60 years doing something almost nobody else on earth could do, taking a language nobody had spoken in 4,000 years, and, tablet by broken tablet, teaching it to speak again. That's not a smaller story than the sensational one. It might be a bigger one. Kramer didn't need a secret to be remarkable. He built an entire field of human knowledge out of clay and patience, and the world that reads about the first law code, the first love song, and the first written lullaby is reading about them at all because one stubborn, self-taught scholar in a Philadelphia basement refused to let a dead language stay dead.